inner truth. The chop is nice. 2 yang lines below, 2 yang lines above, 2 yin lines in the middle. That the inner truth is the material, is the form, that it is the truth. This is the pressure of the unknown and the unknowable. This is the gate of mystery. This is the gate of individual madness. This is the right angle cross of Maya. 61, 62, 32, 42. Remember that this cross of Maya is about embracing the Maya. And one cannot embrace the Maya until it is understood. I have my design sun in 61.1. The nature of my unconscious mind and this knowledge as it moved through me, all of that is to reveal the inner mechanic. Above the line it says the awareness of universal underlying principles. That's the Maya field. And the basis of this is occult knowledge. Neptune exalted, and we had a whole generation of children, tens of millions of them who are in the world now, who carry Neptune in 61.1. There's a huge generation of them. It's really quite something. They, more than any other generation, are going to be the real foundation of human design in the future. They will all carry with them this openness and this recognition of its inherent truth. Neptune exalted a natural psychic awareness that empowers principles of universalization. That is, the pressure to know the mysteries through esoterics. In other words, that all the knowledge necessary isn't available on the surface, it has to be dug out. And that you can't really grasp the Maya until you get right down to its roots. It's why human design is the mechanics of the Maya. Venus in detriment, where a reliance on secret knowledge increasingly demands ascetic withdrawal and leads eventually to obscurity, where the pressure can be so strong that one can be eventually incapable of handling the esoteric realities. Mostly what this is about is people that get into very odd things. Remember, this is generally speaking about universal principles. You know, you get into people who think that the whole knowledge of the world can be found on the bumps of somebody's head. That's typical of a 61.1 with Venus. You know, the obscure. Doesn't mean it's bad or not of value, but it is obscure. And it's very difficult to universalize out of such a poor base. It is a gate of the individual mental process, and the mind is a mind of anxiety. Here is the pressure to be mad if you can't know what is knowable. The credo of the mental knower. The credo of the mental knower is know what you need to know, don't bother to know what you don't need to know, and don't pay any attention to the unknowable. And then you'll stay mentally healthy. The second line, natural brilliance. Natural brilliance. Here is mind exploring in its own environment outside of influence. It is others that see it as natural brilliance. Others, not the participant. The moon exalted and so gifted by this position of far-reaching and nourishing influence, free of guile and powerfully attractive. How nice. A gift for inspiration that is both attractive and beneficial to others. That doesn't mean it's beneficial to them. They really don't like being bothered. This is the profile of the mad scientist. You know, so brilliant but locked in their own web. and then called out, and in being called out, of course, becoming very uncomfortable, being placed under pressure to be of benefit in their knowing to others. They may not be ready. Mars in detriment that in early recognition of its influence becomes ego-obsessed with maximizing its effects. A delusion that any inspiration deserves recognition. You know, you're a child, you got the 61 too, and somebody asks you a question and you give them a wonderful answer. It's now expected of you that you can always give wonderful answers. Not only that, everybody expects you to give wonderful answers. And you, under that projection, assume that you can always give wonderful answers until the next time when the answer ain't so wonderful. And that delusion gets smashed. Second lines can always be paper tigers. You know, look like a bear, smell like a bear, but in the end, not a bear at all. That's why it's so important to educate second line aspects. This is the place for education. Interdependence. It is exceedingly difficult for truth to stand alone. Amen. You got a lower trigram personal destiny process that's limited to the 61st gate and no recognition that there's this rationalizing capacity of awareness at the other end in the 24. People who only have the 61st gate have an enormous amount of pressure in their head acoustically. Remember that individuality is acoustic. These are people that are always hearing sounds in their heads. Buzzing sounds, ringing in their ears, their own voice, music in their head. This is a typical individual trait, but particularly so with the 61 when it has no outlet because there's a tremendous amount of pressure there. There can even be this density in the hearing that comes at times from that pressure, as if there's cotton wool inside the ears. The moon exalted the ability to establish relationships for the actualization of truths, and through their nurturing and protective power to ensure a stable environment in which they can continue to grow. The pressure to know enhanced through collaboration. Now look, that all sounds great, but you're dealing with an individual that's under pressure, has a lot of anxiety, is melancholic, and it doesn't mean that the 24 is going to rationalize successfully for it. What it is saying to you is the dilemma or the mechanic that you see in all third lines. All third lines are trying to learn through trial and error how to be social. You know, this is a natural movement from the third line to the fourth line. These, you know, they sit at this midpoint together. They're both basically unstable. You know, the third line is unstable because it is in the personal process and yet it's getting ready to step into the transpersonal. So it's growing in that sense. It's getting to that point. So it's beginning to try to figure out what the other is. Remember, that's the basis of wisdom. That's how you get to be a role model. You know, by being a martyr in your own experiments. Mars in detriment. With an abundance of energy and in a possession of a truth, the tendency to leave others behind or be crushed by their resistance, impatience with others, and the forsaking of relationships. Now remember, trial and error. The most difficult thing in the world to do is to rationalize somebody else's 61 to the satisfaction of that 61. After all, it's not going to be their knowing. This is the whole thing about knowers. You can put anything in front of them, but until they can internalize that into their own knowing system, then they will give it no respect. So all this nice, you know, through collaboration, what you're really seeing is that's what they try to do to actualize their truth. It's a process. And of course, to understand that in the way in which we're structured genetically, We know that the individual at the 23rd gate has to be able to explain their knowing. And that means they have to have the tools to be explain their knowing to the other. So from the very beginning is a pressure that says the knowing isn't enough if you can't get it into the consciousness of the other, if you can't mutate it. So from the very beginning there's this pressure. And there's this pressure on the individual to learn how to socially adapt, which is very difficult. And yet in all individual gates you will see this, this pressure on the individual to remember that they really aren't alone, because if they really act like that, the other isn't going to pay any attention to them and is going to be hostile towards them. And remember that the individual doesn't want to be influenced, it's designed to be influenced by the other, and yet at the same time has to learn how to find a way to be with and mutate the other. A lot of pressure, a lot of anxiety. When you get to the 4th line and you reach the upper trigram, you reach a transpersonal stage, then you can see that the occult knowledge, that the universal principles that can be discovered in the foundation can be externalized in the 4th line as research. And research in the modern sense of that word, because we understand research as something that is coordinated and that there are many different forces involved. In other words, the research factories that we have, these R&D places. Saturn exalted the capacity of concentration to explore the depths of inner truth and maximize its application of fundamental principles. The pressure to know the fundamental principles. And that the only way that you can get them is through research. Now, when I have somebody who has this line, I tell them that research is important for them in their own process, that they have to do their research, they have to dig into their knowing, that they have to get all the background, they have to go through the process. But in the larger spectrum, it means that they have a gift of being able to find collaboration for their research. Jupiter in detriment, where the tendency to expansion and integration leads to involving others in the research and may end in diversity of confusing applications. Now, the fact that it ends up in a diversity of confusing applications does not mean that's bad. In other words, when you get down to the 23rd gate, you'll discover that there's a line that says you have to explain how everything comes out of the one, and there's a line that explains that you can never explain how everything comes out of the one. You have to explain how everything goes into the one. This is part of the process of being a knower. Mutation is not a value unless it can transform the totality. That's what the mutation is all about. The illusion that collaboration will enhance inspiration. That isn't to say to these people, hey, look, the moment that you collaborate with somebody else, that you're going to have confusing diversity and this is bad. That's a design. That's not bad. But what it's saying is how they enter into that. How they enter in as their definition, as their type, with their authority, so that they can be clear that they're with the right forces to collaborate with, that even when the result is still going to be diversity and confusing applications, it doesn't mean that that's bad. That diversity may open up all kinds of verification of that knowing. Remember that the 4th line here can only recognize that there's a 24 at the other end. The rationalization is not the completion of the process. It's just a step along the way. All those confusing applications may be resolved in the 43 through insight and fully explained through the 23. It's a process. In the last 7 minutes and 30 seconds of the 4th line, we have the change in the cross. And the 3242 is replaced with the 50 and the 3. That gives us the juxtaposition cross of thinking. This was the model for the thinker, this classic chin to jaw. This is their cross. They all come in, they're born that way, they got their fists in their face. The 61, 62, 50, and the 3. They are the great thinkers. They are deeply going to be fixed and absorbed in that research process. These are people that are always in the process of knowing. That doesn't mean they know. It's just they're on the ongoing trail of what they think might be knowable. Remember that madness comes by trying to know what is unknowable. That anxiety comes from trying to know things you don't need to know. That peace comes from knowing what you need to know. Know thyself. That is what you need to know. If you don't have to know how a rocket engine works, don't bother. If it isn't important for you in your life, don't pay attention to it. And what is unknowable, as long as you pursue what is unknowable, is Jesus going to stand in my bedroom tonight? As long as you are looking for that unknowable, you are going to go progressively bonkers. The 61 without an outlet, that's quite a pressure. The left angle cross is the cross of obscuration. This is a delicate little wonder here. They obscure or not. Influence. Saturn exalted. 5th line. The enlightened father figure, mother figure, whose recognized wisdom and powerful assertion can mold a generation by its influence. The pressure to know that may result in influence and wisdom. Now think about the 61.5. They're going to bring their practical thought, their knowing, only in times of crisis, only when they can get advantage from that. And it's always projected on the 61.5 that they know more than they really do. So if they make an error in their knowing, that is a shattering process for them. The Mars in detriment is a tendency in power to want to enforce compliance to ensure lasting influence. That is the pressure in knowing to resent challenges and demand acceptance. The moment somebody projects on you and they say, when you tell them what you know, if they resist you, you don't bend to that. Remember that the 5th line has the capacity to be able to establish right away what's of advantage to them and when. And because of that, because they are under the pressure of the collective projection, they can establish their terms. I will come and help you. I will do this thing and then I'm finished and then I go away. You give me your reward. They're always able to do that. So here in the Mars, this taking of opportunity to influence, they're going to resent any kind of challenge. You know already that individuality resents challenge as a way of life. And of course, it's very difficult when all you are is an inspiration and a pressure and you're not in awareness to say my way or the highway. Tough position to be in to do that. The advantage that the 5th line has is that it has all these willing collaborators because they're projecting on the 5th line that it really knows and that its practical solution will work. Remember, not all generals are successful. No, just not. And a lot of heretics get burnt at the stake. The 6th line. Appeal. Pluto exalted, the profound attunement to the collectivity, that can lure the public to a truth, inspiration that can bring clarity to the collective. After these people have gone through their interdependent stage, their third line phase, when they get to the point where they see that their knowing may never really manifest, that they begin to be very clear voices discriminating between what is valuable knowing, mutative knowing, and what isn't. That profound attunement allows them to point out to what knowing is really of value. They're the ones who know whether the fifth line has any value or not, whether that influence is justified or not, whether that knowing is practical or not. And because of that, they can lure the public to the truth. In other words, it's not their knowing, it's knowing other knowings. That's their knowing. To know the value of the knowing of others. And as I described to you, the power of the sixth line is that when the villagers are frightened of the behavioral changes demanded by the heretic, that they climb up the mountain to the fool on the hill, to the sage, and say, "Look, what do you think of all this?" And the sixth says, they know what they're talking about. That's sufficient to lure the public to that truth. If, on the other hand, they said, "Burn him at the stake, this knowledge is garbage," the villagers go racing down the hill and they get the firewood right away. I always loved Bruce Coburn's, I don't remember the actual song, but there was this lyric in it that said, "Burn, baby, burn, when do I get my turn?" Mars and detriment, great heretic line. Mars and detriment, a reliance on shop-worn cliches and slogans that may be new in their level of energy, but inevitably fall on deaf ears. The delusion that inspiration can bring clarity to the collective. When you try to get the collective to know something, you have to use many things if you're a knower. You know, you have to use images, examples, parables, stories, examples. And of course, what happens is that you end up getting caught up in trying to use the collective's language to describe the knowing, and then the collective doesn't see that as knowing at all because it can always argue with you. You know, oh, that old cliche. And then out of their collective business, they find a format for argumentation. Very difficult stage in the individual process is the point at which expression is necessary. Because one must be able to use the language of the collective without being collective, so as not to get caught in that trap. And most knowers, if you listen to their descriptions of things, you will see that they borrow extensively from both collective ways. You know, the storytelling of the abstract and the reasonable description of the logic. It'll fall on deaf ears if there's nothing new to hear in that. Remember that the only time that the individual really gets any recognition is when they are mutative and different and are bringing something new to the collective that the collective has never had access to before. So if you cloud that with too much collective language, it loses its individual impact. I mean, I found that out, for example, through the terminology of exalted and detriment. You know, in taking that from astrology as a terminology, it gave the collective a chance to get lost in that terminology when the best mutative thing came later, which is that I insisted that we have these triangles to replace it. Because it gives the collective too much of a chance to be prejudiced. Because they already have access. That's not new. They have access to that terminology. And even though it's being used in a different way, they have their old way of argumenting with it. And then they end up having deaf ears to what you're telling them. You know, I keep on telling you detriments are not bad. And, there's still a part of the collective in you that says, of course they are. What the hell is he talking about? And if I never get to live out myself, they're going to be bad all my life. Oh, no. That's true. So at this point of appeal, of getting to the point where you understand what knowing can mutate the collective, can be attractive to the collective, you go to the beginning of this process, you go to the 60th gate. I like that. The 61 and 60 are opposite each other at either end of the body graph and beside each other in the wheel. They're very similar to each other. They have the same lower trigram. Part of the same house. And of course, the 60th gate is the gate of limitation.